Sure. So variable consideration, as the name suggests, is just any kind of consideration in a contract that isn't fixed at inception, fixed and known. So think about things like rebates, discounts, incentives that you could earn as a seller under a contract. It also happens to include variability that could exist in a contract because of price indexation, and that's often something that we see in our industry. So variable consideration under today's GAAP is treated quite differently than it's going to be under the new model. Under today's GAAP, variable consideration, or what we sometimes call contingent revenue, is almost always deferred until it's realized, or not recognized until realized. And so we don't see much recognition of these variable amounts until the earnings event, the billing effectively has occurred. Under the new model, the standard will require you to actually estimate what the variable consideration will be over the contract term and include that in your transaction price, which is then allocated across your performance obligations and recognized as earned. Now, the one caveat is that there's this notion of a constraint built into the new model, and the constraint just means you're going to take a haircut to your estimate of variable consideration to the extent that there could be a significant reversal of revenue that might happen in the future. So the constraint tells you to only recognize variable consideration if it's probable that a significant reversal in revenue will not occur down the road. So as I think about our industry, I typically bucket the forms of variability into two primary buckets. One is variability driven by price, and the other is variability driven by volumes. And we'll talk about pricing first. So under pricing, I think there are going to be a couple different forms of price variability. One is a form that's linked in general to the delivery month of the commodity in question or of the service in question. And in many cases in our industry, we are going to find that the variable consideration does get resolved within the delivery month. One primary example of that would be indexation, a commodity contract that's got a variability in pricing due to being indexed to some commodity index, and so the pricing will be established each month and paid each month. In those cases, the indexation is tied to the specific delivery month. The variability is resolved in that delivery month, and you would really just attribute the variability to that delivery period. It really wouldn't result in much change at all to current practice, which I think is a good answer. The other form of price variability that we see in a lot of cases is something that plant owners typically have a chance to earn in connection with a long-term sale arrangement in the form of a performance bonus. So you may have a performance bonus for something like maintaining a certain level of availability over a 20-year power sale arrangement if your plant is available at a certain rate over that period of time. And in those cases, unlike today's GAAP where you may have to wait to recognize that till the end, we think it would be appropriate to estimate what that performance bonus will be at the end of the contract period and then recognize it as you earn it over time. And so the standard is going to talk about different approaches to estimating variable consideration in situations like that. There's a couple of different methods. One is a most likely amount method, and one is more of a probability weighted method. But depending on what method is most appropriate, you would estimate an amount to be included in your transaction price, and you'd actually recognize revenue along the way. In my example, you'd recognize revenue each year that your plant was available at a percentage that was high enough to earn a bonus, and at the end of the contract period you should have recognized the appropriate amount of revenue. Another form of variability that exists in our industry is related to volumes. And so when I think of volume variability, the main example that comes to mind is requirements contracts. So contracts where a utility agrees with a customer to provide the amount of commodity they need to run their business or to run some sort of operation, but there isn't perhaps a stipulated minimum. There often will not be a max either. It's just a full requirements contract based on the buyer's needs. And so the question that arises here is, how do we think about those volume variations? Do we think about those as part of the transaction price? And do we have to make an estimate of what the volume variability will be, what the ultimate volume taken will be for revenue purposes? Or can we view these, or should we view these as something that we refer to now as optional purchases? So every time that the customer needs a unit of commodity, they ask the utility for it, and the utility is required to stand ready to provide that volume. But until the customer makes the request, the utility doesn't really have the right to sell the commodity, and the customer hasn't obligated themselves to buy it. There's some different thoughts around this issue, thoughts around like economic compulsion and sole source delivery arrangements. But the TRG has actually looked at this issue not in a utility-specific environment, but in a broader context. And they've reached some conclusions that indicate that being the sole source provider or having a customer that's economically compelled to buy from you do not, in and of themselves, establish a contractual requirement to buy. And so they've tended to view a lot of these types of arrangements as consisting of optional purchases. So at the task force level, we've looked at this one and we've concluded that we think for the most part requirements contracts and similar contracts in the industry are going to be those that will be viewed as containing optional purchases, and therefore you will not have to estimate the variability associated with the volume uncertainty inherent in those arrangements. So this one is an issue that the task force has coalesced around an answer. Again, particularly on the volume side, we think that the volume variability will very often be treated as optional purchases and will not therefore have to be estimated in coming up with your transaction price for your arrangement. We do anticipate perhaps some pushback when we raise this one up through the review levels, the Revenue Recognition Working Group being the first group we'll talk to. One of the reasons that we anticipate perhaps some pushback is when the TRG addressed this issue in a more general context. They did think about several examples that, if applied in a utility setting, might result in different answers. So we believe that there are meaningful differences between our fact patterns and the ones the TRG looked at that support our position, but we might get some pushback up the chain. We're ready for that, though. I think we have good positions, and I'm optimistic that the task force consensus will stand. On price variability, I think we have a full consensus on that as well, and I really don't see much of a risk that those answers would flip. I think the standard's pretty clear about attributing price variability to the period in which the variability relates. So my example is about the delivery month and the price variability relating to a delivery month. I think that one's pretty safe. And the example that I use involving the performance bonus, I think likewise is pretty safe, because that just involves the application of the estimation techniques that they already require in the standard. And so as long as you're applying the estimation techniques right, I think that one will stand as well.